There is a place on the map where two countries meet, and the border itself disappears into something that the border never agreed to contain. On one side, India, on the other, Myanmar. And between them, running through mountains and river valleys and forests so dense that aerial photography sometimes returns nothing but an unbroken canopy of green, there is a zone that governments draw lines through on paper and that the land itself ignores completely. Drones sent into certain corridors of this region have not come back. Satellites pass over and return images that analysts describe, carefully and with deliberate understatement, as inconclusive. Military patrols from both sides reach their designated stopping points and turn around, because what lies beyond those points is not managed by either military. What lies beyond those points has its own management, has had its own management for longer than either nation has existed. Subscribe right now if you want to see the world the way it actually is, not the sanitized version, not the geopolitical abstraction, not the line on the map, but the actual place, the actual people, the history and the geography, and the human reality that makes this one of the most extraordinary and least understood corridors on the face of the earth. Let us go. The region we are talking about stretches roughly along the mountainous border that runs between the Indian states of Manipur, Nagaland, and Mizoram on the western side, and the Sagaing region and Chin state of Myanmar on the eastern side. If you were to draw a straight line from the northern tip of this zone to its southern end, you would cover somewhere in the vicinity of 800 kilometers, but geography in this part of the world does not move in straight lines. The terrain is a corrugation of ridges running roughly north to south, the tail end of the Himalayas reaching down through Southeast Asia, with river valleys cutting between them, and the actual border, a product of British colonial administration and the particular difficulties of governing a mountainous interior that they never fully controlled, follows the ridgelines in a way that made theoretical sense on a map drawn in Calcutta and makes considerably less sense when you are standing in the forest trying to determine which side of the watershed you are on. This is the first thing to understand about the border zone between India and Myanmar. It is not a line. It is a landscape. A vast, complicated, ecologically extraordinary landscape that happens to have a political designation attached to it, a designation that the landscape predates by several 100 million years, and that the people who live in it have spent the last several centuries treating with a pragmatism that makes complete sense once you understand the history. Because here is the thing about the communities that inhabit this border zone. They did not come to this landscape after the border was drawn and orient their lives around it. The border was drawn through a landscape that they already occupied, had occupied for centuries, had organized their lives and their relationships and their trade routes and their marriages and their ritual obligations around, long before anyone in London or Delhi or Rangoon decided to draw a line through the mountains and declare that everything on one side was one thing and everything on the other side was another. The border came to them, and they continued doing what they had always done. The Naga people. Let us start there, because no honest account of this border zone can begin anywhere else. The Naga are not a single people, in the sense of a homogeneous ethnic group, with a single language and a single culture. They are a collection of tribes, dozens of them, each with its own distinct language, its own particular customs and rituals and histories, its own relationship to the land and to the other tribes around it. The Ao, the Angami, the Sima, the Lotha, the Tungkul, the Konyak, the Zeliangrong, the Phom, the Chang, the Yimchungar, and many more, all of them carrying the name Naga as a kind of geographic and broadly cultural designation, while remaining in their day-to-day lives and in their deepest identities the specific tribe they were born into. What unites the Naga, across all their internal diversity, is the landscape they have lived in for centuries, the high mountains and dense forests of the Naga Hills, and a set of cultural orientations that were shaped by that landscape. The traditional Naga village is not just a settlement, it is a fortress. Built on hilltops, surrounded by stone walls or wooden palisades in earlier times, positioned to give the maximum visibility in all directions, because the historical reality of Naga life for many centuries was one of intertribal conflict, of headhunting raids and retaliatory expeditions, of the need to know what was coming over the ridge before it arrived. The hilltop village is a military solution to a military problem. But it is also something more than that. It is an assertion of presence in a landscape, a declaration that this particular hill, this particular watershed, this particular stretch of forest belongs to this particular community. The Morung is the institution that perhaps best captures the particular social genius of traditional Naga organization. In most Naga tribes, the Morung is a communal longhouse where unmarried young men live, sleep, eat, and learn. It is simultaneously a dormitory and a school, and a military barracks and a cultural archive. The older men of the village teach the younger men in the Morung, and what they teach is everything. How to hunt and how to farm, and how to read weather, and how to track animals through forest, and how to build and how to fight, and how to negotiate, and how to conduct the rituals that maintain the relationship between the community and the spiritual forces that the Naga understand to inhabit the landscape around them. The Morung is how a culture reproduces itself, how the specific knowledge of this particular tribe is passed from the generation that holds it to the generation that will need it. It is the living archive of a people who historically kept no written records and needed none, because the Morung was a more robust and more complete system of transmission than any writing could provide. The art of the Naga is inseparable from all of this. The carved wooden posts that stand outside the Morung, depicting warriors and animals and the various beings that inhabit the Naga spiritual universe. The textile traditions, particularly the weaving of the distinctive shawls that in traditional Naga society are not merely garments but markers of identity and achievement. Each tribe, and within each tribe, each category of person having their specific patterns and colors, and the wearing of the wrong pattern by the wrong person being a social transgression of real significance. The tattoos that in certain Naga tribes historically marked the taking of heads, that most extreme form of the intertribal conflict that shaped so much of Naga social life, and that the colonial British administration tried to suppress with mixed success, and that Christian missionary activity, which spread through the Naga hills from the late 19th century onwards with remarkable thoroughness, eventually transformed if not entirely ended. The Christianity of the Naga hills is itself a fascinating and complex subject, because it arrived as a colonial imposition, brought by American Baptist missionaries who began working in the region in the 1870s and became so thoroughly Naga that it is now one of the markers of Naga identity rather than an intrusion upon it. Most Naga today are Christian, and their Christianity is practiced with an intensity and a communal investment that reflects the same social energy that the Morung once organized. The church in a Naga village is often the largest building, the most elaborately constructed, the center of community life in the same way that the Morung once was. The hymns are sung in Naga languages, the festivals of the Christian calendar have been layered over, and in some cases merged with the agricultural and ritual festivals that predate Christianity in the region. The result is something that is neither purely Christian in any Western denominational sense, nor purely the pre-Christian Naga practice, but a genuine synthesis, a new thing, growing out of the collision between an ancient culture and a foreign religion in a particular landscape at a particular historical moment. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the border, because the border is why we are here. The Naga Hills were one of the last parts of the Indian subcontinent to be brought under nominal British control, and even then the control was always more nominal than real. The British strategy for governing the region was essentially a managed withdrawal. They established administrative posts at the edges of the hills and required that the tribes not raid into the lowland areas they could more easily control. But they did not attempt to govern the interior of the hills with anything like the administrative apparatus they used in the rest of India. The hills were too difficult. The terrain was too complex. The tribes were too numerous and too capable of resistance. And the British had made the calculation, which was probably correct, that the cost of genuinely pacifying the Naga hills would exceed whatever benefit controlling them would bring, so they drew lines. They designated some areas as administered territory, where British law nominally applied, and other areas as unadministered territory, where it did not, where the tribes were left to govern themselves according to their own customs, where a British officer who crossed the boundary did so at their own risk and without the official backing of the Raj. The inner line, established in 1873, was the formal boundary of this administrative recognition of the limits of colonial control. It still exists today, in modified form, as the Inner Line Permit System that governs which Indian citizens can travel into the northeastern states, a legacy of a colonial administrative decision that has taken on entirely new meanings in the post-independence context. And when independence came, when the British departed, and India and Burma became separate nations with their own governments and their own borders, the Naga found themselves divided. Some Naga were now Indian. Some Naga were now Burmese. The border between the two new nations ran through the Naga Hills in a way that split families, split villages in some cases, split the territory of particular tribes across a newly international boundary. And the Naga response to this was, broadly speaking, to regard the boundary as something that had been done to them rather than something they had participated in creating, and to continue treating the landscape as the unified territory that it always had been. The Naga political movement for an independent Naga homeland, which began formally in 1918 with the establishment of the Naga Club and escalated through the 1940s and beyond as independence approached and then arrived, was precisely a rejection of the division of Naga territory between India and Burma. The Nagas who signed the Declaration of Naga Independence in 1947, one day before India's own independence, who negotiated with Gandhi and Nehru and told them plainly that the Naga Hills were not part of India and never had been, were making a claim that was geographically and historically coherent, even if it was politically impossible, in the context of the new nation-states being born around them. The armed insurgency that followed, the decades of conflict between the Indian state and various Naga armed groups fighting for independence or autonomy, is one of the longest-running insurgencies in Asia, beginning in the early 1950s and continuing, in various forms and with various ceasefires and negotiations and factional splits, to the present day. It has cost tens of thousands of lives. It has shaped the political landscape of Northeast India in ways that affect everything from local governance to the daily experience of ordinary people. It has also had the effect, which was perhaps partly its purpose, of maintaining the border zone as an area where the Indian state's control is contested and where the authority of the government in New Delhi is not the only, or in some areas even the primary, authority operating. The forest. Let us talk about the forest, because the forest is not merely the backdrop to the human drama we are describing, it is itself a protagonist. The forests of the Indo-Myanmar border zone are among the most biologically significant on the planet. They sit at the intersection of three of the world's great biogeographic zones, the Indian subcontinent, mainland Southeast Asia, and what ecologists call the Indo-Burma Biodiversity Hotspot, one of 36 areas in the world, identified by Conservation International as having exceptional concentrations of endemic species facing exceptional threat. The species richness of this forest is extraordinary. Plants and animals that exist nowhere else on Earth, or nowhere else in Asia, or in concentrations found nowhere else in the region, live in the mountains and valleys of this border zone. The hoolock gibbon, Asia's only ape, calls from the forest canopy. The clouded leopard moves through the understory with the particular liquid grace of a cat that has evolved to hunt in trees. The great Indian hornbill, that spectacular bird with its absurd and magnificent casque, its wing beats audible from hundreds of meters away, a sound that has been described as the sound of a slow helicopter, nests in the hollow of old forest trees that only exist in old forest that has never been cleared. Tigers, elephants, sun bears, binturong, slow lorises with their enormous eyes, looking like something that should be fictional. All of them here, in numbers that in some areas are higher than anywhere else in their ranges, precisely because the forest has not been cleared. And the forest has not been cleared in significant part because the area has been too difficult and too contested for the kind of development that has destroyed forest everywhere else. The conflict, in other words, has been an accidental conservation strategy. The places where governments cannot easily go are places where logging companies and road builders and agricultural expansion also cannot easily go. The zones of contested authority are zones where the extractive industries that have stripped so much of Asia's lowland forest have not been able to operate without risk. The Naga insurgency and the various other armed groups that have operated in the border zone, including the Meitei groups in Manipur and the Chin resistance in Myanmar, and more recently the People's Defense Force, fighting the military junta that seized power in Myanmar in 2021, have, without intending it, protected one of Asia's most significant forest ecosystems. This is not a comfortable fact. It is not a fact that suggests conflict is a good conservation strategy. The people who have suffered in these conflicts, and there have been many of them, were not suffering for the sake of the hornbills. But it is a fact, and it belongs to an honest accounting of why this particular forest still exists in a region where forests have otherwise been devastated, the Konyak Naga. We need to spend time with the Konyak, because among all the Naga tribes, the Konyak have perhaps the most dramatic and most misunderstood history, and they live precisely in the area of the border zone that is most impenetrable, the high country along the ridge where Nagaland meets Myanmar's Sagaing region. The Konyak were the last Naga tribe to be contacted by the British, and the last to abandon headhunting, and the combination of these two facts has made them the tribe most associated in outsider imaginations with the most extreme aspects of Naga traditional culture. They are described in colonial accounts with a mixture of fascination and horror that says more about the colonial writers than it does about the Konyak, and they are photographed today by visitors who come looking for the last of the tattooed headhunters, the elderly men whose faces bear the marks of their historic taking of heads, with an eagerness that can easily slide from genuine interest into something more uncomfortable. What the photographs of old Konyak men with their facial tattoos and their bronze jewelry and their traditional dress tend not to capture is the complexity of the society that produced them. The Konyak political system was more hierarchical than most other Naga tribes, centered on the figure of the Ong, the chief, who in the more powerful Konyak villages wielded authority over a network of subordinate villages and who occupied a position that was simultaneously political, military, and sacred. The Ang's legitimacy derived not only from force but from ritual, from their role as intermediary between the community and the supernatural forces that governed the fertility of the fields and the success of the hunt and the outcome of the raid. Because raiding was not merely a military activity in Konyak society. It was a ritual one. The head taken in a raid carried spiritual power that benefited the entire community that received it. The warrior who took a head gained status, gained the right to tattoos that marked his achievement, gained eligibility to wear certain ornaments and certain textiles that were otherwise prohibited. The head was deposited in the morung, where it enhanced the supernatural potency of the communal longhouse. This is the practice that Christian missionaries and the Indian state both worked to end, and which has indeed ended, at least in its literal form, among the Konyak today. But the social structures that organized it, the village hierarchy, the role of the Ong, the importance of the morung, the significance of textile and ornament as markers of social position and achievement. These persist, transformed but recognizable, into the present. The elderly men who sit in the morung and remember their history are not relics. They are elders, with the authority and the social function that elders have always had in Konyak society. The tattooed face is a record, a biography in ink, and the man wearing it has a life story of extraordinary richness and complexity that the tourist photograph can never fully access. The border means something specific to the Konyak in a way that it does not mean to the administrators of either India or Myanmar. Konyak villages exist on both sides of it. Konyak social relationships, marriages and trade relationships, and the subordinate village networks of the various Ong cross it without ceremony. A Konyak family in a border village may have relatives in India and relatives in Myanmar, and may move between the two sides in the course of ordinary life, without any particular consciousness of having crossed an international boundary. The boundary is there, the Konyak know it is there, but it is there the way a natural feature is there, a river or a ridgeline, something that has to be navigated rather than something that defines the fundamental structure of life. Now, the things that come through this border. We need to talk about this with honesty and without sensationalism, because the permeability of this border is not just a fact about traditional communities maintaining their ancestral connections. It is also a fact with significant consequences for the security situation in the region and for the lives of people who live in the border zone. The border between India and Myanmar is one of the most significant routes for various forms of trafficking in Asia. Arms, drugs, people. The specific mix has changed over time as the political and economic conditions on both sides have shifted, but the permeability of the border, the same permeability that allows a Konyak family to visit their relatives across the ridge, also allows other movements that are less benign. The Golden Triangle, the area where the borders of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand meet, and which has been one of the world's major opium-producing regions since the mid-20th century, is not where the drug production for this border zone primarily originates. The Sagaling region of Myanmar, which borders Nagaland and Manipur on the Indian side, has in recent decades become a significant production area in its own right, and the drugs produced there have found routes into India through the mountain passes of the border zone. Heroin and more recently methamphetamine in its various forms, known across South and Southeast Asia by various names, move through networks that use exactly the same knowledge of the landscape and the same social connections between border communities that traditional trade has always used. The armed groups that control territory in the border zone are not indifferent to this traffic. Some of them have taxed it, some of them have facilitated it, some of them have fought against it, because a community ravaged by addiction is not a community that can sustain an insurgency or a resistance movement. The relationship between the political violence of the border zone and the economic reality of the drug trade is complicated and has changed significantly over the decades as different groups have risen and fallen, and as the political situation in Myanmar has shifted, most dramatically with the military coup of February 2021 that overthrew the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi and plunged the country into a new phase of brutal conflict. The coup changed everything in the border zone and is still changing it. The military junta, known as the SAC, the State Administration Council, immediately faced resistance not only from the predominantly Burman population of the country's center, but from the ethnic minority groups along its borders, groups that had been resisting successive Burmese military governments since independence and that had developed over decades the organizational capacity and the territorial control to mount serious armed resistance. The Chin National Army and its associated political organizations in Chin State, which borders Mizoram on the Indian side, the various Naga groups operating in Sagaing region, the Arakan Army in Rakhine State, the Karen National Union and the Karenni Resistance in the east. All of them, with varying degrees of coordination and success, fighting against a military that controls most of the country's cities and lowlands, but that has never fully controlled the border highlands. The people fleeing the conflict in Myanmar have come to India. They have come through the same mountain passes that trade and family connections have always used. They have come into Mizoram and Manipur, crossing into territories where people speak languages related to their own, where there are existing communities of Chin and Kuki and Zhu people who share ethnic and cultural ties with the refugees. The Indian central government's response to this movement has been contradictory, with some state governments expressing solidarity with the refugees and the central government attempting to enforce a border closure that the terrain makes difficult to enforce, and that the existing social connections make deeply unpopular with the communities through which it would have to be enforced. Mizoram. This is a state that deserves its own examination, because it is one of the most extraordinary social and political stories in all of Northeast India, and it is almost completely unknown outside the region. The Mizo people, who inhabit this narrow strip of mountains between Assam to the north and Myanmar to the east, and Bangladesh to the west, experienced one of the most brutal episodes of counterinsurgency in post-colonial South Asian history in the 1960s and 1970s, when the Indian Air Force bombed their villages and the Indian Army carried out a campaign of forced village regroupment, moving entire rural populations into designated centers to cut them off from the Mizo National Front insurgency, a strategy borrowed from British counterinsurgency doctrine and applied with a ruthlessness that the Indian government still does not fully acknowledge. The Mizo National Front insurgency, which began with the famine of 1959, when the Mautam, the flowering of the bamboo that happens every 48 years and brings with it an explosion of rats that consume the grain harvest, devastated the Mizo economy, and the Indian government's response was catastrophically inadequate, became one of the most complete insurgencies in the region. By the mid-1960s, the MNF controlled large parts of the Mizo Hills and had declared independence. The Indian response was overwhelming military force, the bombings, the regrouping, the sweeps, and a period of suffering that the Mizo remember with a specificity and an intensity that has shaped their political identity ever since. The extraordinary thing is what came after. The Mizo Peace Accord of 1986, negotiated between the Indian government and the MNF under its leader Lal Denga, was one of the most successful resolutions of an insurgency in Indian history. Lal Denga and the MNF accepted integration into the Indian Union. The state of Mizoram was given significant autonomy under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, and Mizoram became, improbably, one of the most peaceful and most literate and most gender-equal states in India. Mizoram has a literacy rate that rivals Kerala. It has social indicators that far outperform the national average. It has a civil society culture built around the powerful institution of the Young Mizo Association and the churches that have organized Mizo life since Christianity arrived with Welsh missionaries in the late 19th century, that has produced a genuinely functioning community governance, even in the absence of strong state institutions. The transformation from one of India's most violent insurgencies to one of India's most peaceful states, in the space of a generation, is something that political scientists study carefully and that the rest of the world should pay far more attention to than it does. And now Mizoram is at the front line again, not because of its own violence, but because of what is happening across its eastern border in Myanmar, where the Chin people, closely related to the Mizo, are fleeing a military campaign of exceptional brutality, and the Mizo are responding with the same communal solidarity, organized through the same networks of church and YMA and community association that has organized Mizo life for generations. The Zo reunification movement. This is something that is almost entirely unknown outside the region, and that has significant implications for understanding the border zone. The Mizo, the Chin, the Kuki of Manipur, the Zomi of Myanmar, the Hamar, and several other related groups scattered across the highlands on both sides of the border are related peoples, speaking related languages, sharing related cultural practices, connected by the same ancestral migrations through the mountains that brought them to their current territories over the past several centuries. They call themselves collectively, in various formulations, the Zo, or the Zomi, or the Chin-Kuki Mizo, and there is a political and cultural movement that seeks, with varying degrees of formality and varying degrees of practical ambition, to recognize their unity across the national boundaries that divide them. This movement is not, for the most part, a separatist movement demanding new borders in the conventional sense. It is more a claim for recognition, for the acknowledgement that these communities exist as a coherent people distributed across the boundaries of multiple states, and for the practical adjustments in travel, in cultural exchange, in economic cooperation that would allow them to maintain their connections across those boundaries. It is, in essence, a demand that the border be governed in a way that acknowledges the reality of the communities through which it runs, rather than imposing on those communities a division that was never theirs. The free movement regime, an arrangement that has existed in various forms between India and Myanmar that allowed residents of border areas to cross within a certain distance of the border without a visa, was one practical acknowledgement of this reality. The Indian government announced its intention to end this arrangement in early 2023, citing security concerns, and the announcement was received with dismay by border communities, for whom it represented a fundamental change in the governance of relationships that have existed for centuries. Whether the regime will actually be ended, and what the consequences will be if it is, remains at the time of this telling an open question, one of many open questions in a border zone that is being reshaped by forces operating simultaneously at multiple scales, from the local dynamics of specific communities and their histories, to the regional geopolitics of India-Myanmar-China relations, to the global politics of democracy and authoritarianism, and the movement of people and goods across contested boundaries. China. We cannot talk about the Indo-Myanmar border zone without talking about China, because China's presence in Myanmar and its relationship to the border zone is one of the defining facts of the geopolitical situation in the region. China shares a long border with Myanmar in the north and northeast, and Chinese investment in Myanmar has been enormous and strategically significant, funding infrastructure projects, resource extraction, and various forms of economic presence that give China substantial leverage over the Myanmar state. The China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, one component of the Belt and Road Initiative, is designed to give China overland access to the Indian Ocean through Myanmar, bypassing the strategic vulnerability of the Malacca Strait and opening a new route for Chinese trade and energy imports. This Chinese strategic interest in Myanmar makes the Indo-Myanmar border zone a theater of broader geopolitical competition between India and China, with India watching Chinese influence expand in what it regards as its strategic backyard with considerable alarm. India has its own connectivity projects in the region, including the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway, a road project that aims to connect India's northeast to Southeast Asia through Myanmar, and that has been delayed repeatedly by the very instability in the border zone that we have been describing. The road cannot be built in places where armed groups control the territory, or rather it can be begun and pieces of it can be constructed, but the sections that run through contested terrain remain incomplete. The mountains between. Let us go back to the terrain itself, because the terrain has a way of imposing itself on every human project that encounters it, and nowhere more so than in this particular range of mountains. The hills of the Indo-Myanmar border, this southern extension of the Himalayan system reaching down through what is sometimes called the Indo-Malayan Arc, are geologically relatively young and geomorphologically very active. Earthquakes are common, landslides are common, rivers flood dramatically in the monsoon, when the rainfall in this part of the world is among the most intense in Asia. Several stations in Meghalaya, just to the north, hold world records for annual rainfall. The water that falls on these mountains moves through the landscape with a power and an unpredictability that shapes everything built on it, and everything that grows on it, and everything that moves through it. The rivers of this region are extraordinary. The Chindwin, the great western tributary of the Irrawaddy, begins in the mountains of the border zone on the Myanmar side and flows south through Sagaing region, draining a vast highland catchment before joining the Irrawaddy in the lowlands. The Barak, which rises in the hills of Manipur and flows west into Bangladesh, where it becomes the Surma and the Kushiara, drains the Indian side of the border zone and is one of the great rivers of northeast India, largely unknown in the rest of the country. These rivers are not merely drainage channels. They are highways. They are food sources. They are spiritual entities in the worldview of many of the communities that live alongside them. The Tongkol Naga of Manipur have a complex ritual relationship with the Barak and its tributaries that involves ceremonies at the beginning of the agricultural season and prohibitions on certain activities during certain periods, a form of environmental management embedded in spiritual practice that has maintained the river's ecology in ways that the communities living along it understood intuitively, even without the vocabulary of conservation science. The Jum cultivation. We cannot understand the border zone communities without understanding Jum, the shifting cultivation system that has been the primary agricultural technology of the highland communities of northeast India and mainland Southeast Asia for millennia. Jumum, also called swidden or slash and burn in the outsider literature, both terms that carry pejorative connotations that are not entirely fair, is a system in which forest is cleared, burned, cultivated for 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 seasons, and then allowed to regenerate over a longer period, often 10 to 20 years, before being cleared and cultivated again. The community manages a rotating system of plots in different stages of the cycle, so that at any given time there are plots being cleared, plots being farmed, plots in early regeneration, and plots in mature secondary forest approaching the point of being cleared again. This system, when practiced at traditional scales with traditional population densities and traditional rotation periods, is genuinely sustainable and often genuinely productive. It is the evolutionary product of thousands of years of interaction between highland communities and the specific ecology of tropical and subtropical mountain forests, refined through enormous collective experience into a management system that works with the forest rather than against it. The diversity of crops cultivated in a Jejum field, dozens of varieties of rice, vegetables, medicinal plants, herbs, all grown together in a mixed polyculture that mimics the structure of the forest, is itself a form of agricultural wisdom that modern agricultural science is only beginning to appreciate. The problem with Jejum, and it is a real problem, is that it only works at particular scales. As population has grown in the border zone communities, as the rotation periods have been shortened by population pressure and by loss of land to other uses, the system has become less sustainable. The forest does not have time to recover fully before it is cleared again. The soil degrades faster, the yields decline. And the response of development agencies and governments has typically been to push communities towards sedentary agriculture, toward terraced rice paddies or cash crop cultivation, in ways that sometimes improve food security and sometimes make it worse, depending on the specific circumstances, and that almost always involve a significant loss of the diverse traditional knowledge that chum cultivation carried. But in the border zone, where state authority is limited and development interventions have been sporadic and often conflicted, Jum continues to be practiced by many communities in forms that have adapted to changed circumstances, but that maintain the essential logic of the original system. You can see it from the air. When you fly over the border zone in the dry season, the patches of cleared and burned hillside interspersed with secondary growth in various stages of regeneration. The whole landscape a patchwork of different ages of forest that looks to the untrained eye like deforestation, but that to the trained eye looks like what it actually is, a managed landscape, a cultivated landscape in the deepest sense of that word. The birds. Because I have not mentioned the birds, and I should, because the bird life of the Indo-Myanmar border zone is, even by the extraordinary standards of the biodiversity in this region, exceptional. This is one of the most ornithologically rich corners of the planet, the point where the Indian bird fauna and the Southeast Asian bird fauna overlap and intermix in a landscape of sufficient habitat complexity, river valleys and mountain forests and grasslands and wetlands, to support an astonishing diversity. The Blythe's tragopan, a spectacular mountain pheasant, the white-cheeked hill partridge, the Manipur bush quail, the dark-rumped swift, the Naga wren babbler, named for the people in whose forest it lives, and the white-browed nuthatch, a small bird with a large significance, because it was discovered in the mountains of Myanmar's Chin state relatively recently, in a location that was then so difficult of access that it was barely known to science, and that remains today one of the less documented bird habitats on Earth. The Shirui lily. This is a flower, and it matters, and here is why it matters. The Shirui lily, Lilium maclinii, grows on only one hill in the world, Shirui Hill in Ukhrul district of Manipur, in the Tangkhul Naga territory, in the border zone we have been exploring. It grows there, and nowhere else on Earth. It was not known to Western science until 1946, when the British botanist Frank Kingdon Ward collected it during one of his many plant hunting expeditions through the mountains of the Indo-Burma border. It is a beautiful thing, pale rose-pink, bell-shaped, nodding on its stem in the mountain wind. And it is protected now, the subject of a sanctuary established specifically to protect its single habitat, because a flower that grows on one hill is a flower that can be gone with one bad season or one bad decision. The Shirui lily is a metaphor, if you want a metaphor, though it is also just a lily. It is a metaphor for the particularity of this landscape, the degree to which the biological and cultural richness of the border zone is tied to specific places, specific conditions, specific relationships that have developed over long time, and that cannot be relocated or reconstructed once they are gone. The cognac knowledge of this particular forest. The Mizo collective institutions that organize community response to crisis. The Tangkhul understanding of the river cycles, the Jum cultivator's knowledge of how this particular hillside responds to clearing and burning and planting and rest. These are all forms of the Shirui lily, things that exist here and not elsewhere, things whose value is precisely their specificity. Let us talk about the drones, because we promised to talk about the drones and we should. Not because the drones are the most important thing about this border zone, they are not. But because the failure of the drones tells us something important about the nature of the territory. India has invested significantly in surveillance technology for its northeastern borders, including unmanned aerial vehicles tasked with monitoring the border zone for the movements of armed groups and for illegal crossings. And yet the border zone remains, in significant stretches, effectively unsurveilled by these technologies. Some of this is technical. The terrain creates radar shadows and optical dead zones. The heavy forest canopy, which in this region can be 100 feet high and unbroken for kilometers, prevents aerial observation from revealing what moves beneath it. The weather, particularly in the monsoon season when the border zone is under cloud cover for weeks at a time, renders optical sensors useless for extended periods. Some of it is about the limits of what surveillance can do even when it works. You can observe movement from the air, but you cannot understand it. The drone that photographs a column of figures moving through a forest clearing at night cannot tell you who they are, or where they are going, or why. And in a landscape where subsistence hunting and traditional movement between communities and armed group resupply operations can all look very similar from 3,000 feet, the raw data is often less useful than it appears. And some of it is about something harder to quantify, which is the degree to which the communities of the border zone have, over generations of operating in a landscape that was also a contested space, developed ways of moving through it that are simply very difficult to track with external technology. The forest paths that are not on any map, the crossing points on rivers that are only visible at certain water levels, the timing of movements that takes advantage of weather patterns and times of day, and seasonal rhythms that local knowledge illuminates, and that no satellite database can fully capture. This is not a conspiracy. It is just local knowledge, the kind of local knowledge that every community accumulates about its own landscape over centuries of inhabiting it, and that outside observers almost always underestimate. The young people of the border zone. This is where I want to end, because the young people are where the future of the border zone is being negotiated, in real time, every day, in ways that are not dramatic but that are decisive. The young Naga who goes to university in Kohima or Imphal or Delhi and comes back with a degree in environmental science and a new vocabulary for talking about the forest, but also the same roots in the Morung, the same family connections across the border ridge, the same understanding of the landscape that their grandparents have. The young Mizo who starts a